on climate change, environmental policy and development assistance. Tara was formerly a climate negotiator at the UN and special advisor to the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice and an advisor to the elders. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, Kieran.
Tom Mitchell, Executive Director, International Institute for Environmental and Development, an independent research organisation working for a fairer and more sustainable world. Tom has been going to COPs since Montreal in 2005. Gosh, these guests really love COPs, and has served as an IPCC coordinating lead and a UN senior technical advisor. He has a keen interest in leadership, in complexity and research background on systems innovation, climate resilience and anticipatory governance. Welcome, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us.
Very delighted to be here. Hello, everyone.
Just before we get started, I'd like to invite our viewers to submit any questions they may have in the chat function as we go along, or by emailing info@changebydegrees. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Tara, if I may, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll move to Tom. So, Tara, let's start off with the basic fundamental question I'm sure many people wonder: what is a COP and how do they work?
So thanks, Kieran. Yes, this is the most important starting question. So a COP means a conference of the parties. And the parties to what? The parties to the convention. The convention is the Climate Change Convention, which was created back in 1992. So every year, the parties, so that's the countries that have signed up to the convention, they meet to decide the next collective steps they're going to take to protect the global climate system, which we all need to survive. And then different countries offer to take on the role of presidency of the COP, and that rotates around different regions of the world. So that's why you'll have noticed that the COP takes place in different countries. So it was in Glasgow last year, Egypt this year, and UAE next year. And at their heart, the COPs are a UN negotiation between those countries who are represented at the COP by ministers and civil servants. The meetings have an agenda, in fact, a series of negotiated agenda, and every item on that agenda becomes a decision. And these decisions are legal texts under international law. And we build up this bank of legal texts over time, which inform how the world collectively addresses climate change.
All right, fantastic. And whenever I see COPs, it's always countries involved and the UN involved. If I'm a business or working as a sustainability lead in a business, does it have anything to do with me at all?
Yeah, it does. So first of all, COPs determine international law and create treaties like the Paris Agreement. And in turn, that informs regional law and national law, and that's the context that businesses operate in. So, for example, the Paris Agreement in 2015 led to the EU climate law in 2019 and led to the revision of our, for example, Irish Climate Act in 2021. And then the businesses, you are operating in those contexts. So these laws lead to things like carbon tax, building regulations, changes in transport policy that you have to operate in. So although that international law seems distant, it does come close to us in terms of how it's transposed, if you like, in national law. So now there are 2,950 climate laws and policies around the world, and they're governing every aspect of how business operates. Another example is the fact, for example, that 1.5 degrees was included as a target, a temperature goal in the Paris Agreement. And that means now that businesses, their emissions targets have to align with that Paris or 1.5 degree pathway. So things like the Science Based Targets Initiative are aligned with those temperature goals from the Paris Agreement. And also, in terms of direct contact in a COP, more recently, businesses have become participants at COP. So it's not just governments that go to COPs anymore. Business goes, civil society goes, all kinds of interest groups. And businesses have their own constituency at the COP. It's called the bingos. And they're represented by groups like the International Chamber of Commerce, We Mean Business, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. These are all the umbrella organizations that represent businesses there. So these groups, these business groups, they follow and try to inform the different agenda items under negotiation, but they're also running their own events, sharing their experience and sponsoring these pavilions that tend to be colorful and now in their multitudes at COPs that are all about sharing what's being done in the real world.
Oh, fantastic. So much more than just the UN and countries are there participating. Businesses are at its core as well. I'm reading my Guardian this morning, right? As I'm sure we all do, and I open it up and I see opinion pieces, and I see quite a few of these questioning how COPs work and COPs as a process, saying perhaps are they fit for purpose? Do they work? What do you think as someone who's experienced many of them? Do COPs as a system, as a process on climate action and more work?
So COPs are really the only way, the UN process is really the only way that you get agreement at a multilateral level. And that's hard because it's agreement by consensus. So if one country objects, the whole thing starts to fall apart. So the fact that COPs achieve anything is kind of staggering. But I think it's time to ask the question, actually, is COP fit for purpose? So my first COP in Milan in 2003 was a really small affair compared to COP27. I looked it up. There were 5,151 participants in total at the COP that I went to first in Milan. It was really just governments doing their thing. There were more than 45,000 participants in Sharm el-Sheikh. So it is an order of magnitude different. A COP is now part UN negotiation at its heart, but also part expo. It's partly an expo of climate action around the world. And I think the positives are the fact that so many different interest groups want to be part of the climate solution. They want to be involved. So it's great that people are there talking about health and food and human rights and bringing young people's voices to the table. The negative is that the COP is getting unwieldy, and there is actually no formal way of tracking all the commitments that are made in all of these pavilions and all of these side events. So we need to improve. We need to improve that accountability for all the decisions are taken, not just the formal ones in the negotiation, so that we make sure greenwashing doesn't become a risk within the COPs.
Wow, yeah, absolutely. And 45,000 people taking part in COP27. That's an absolutely staggering number. So COP27 in Egypt, what did it set out to achieve? What was on the agenda on day one? Things that they really wanted to accomplish, the headline issues. What were they?
So COP27 was always branded as an implementation COP. So really by the end of Glasgow last year, we'd agreed the rule book for Paris, and really it's about implementation now, what's happening in countries, in companies around the world. So this was always going to be a kind of a low-key COP, and it was also a COP that we thought would have to really address some of the issues for Africa, which are really around vulnerability to climate impacts, and the impacts of climate on food security, and we come back to it later, this issue of loss and damage. But the big deadlines actually fall next year into COP28. Things like the culmination of the global stocktake fall into next year. But it was an invitation issued at Glasgow for countries to come back to the table with improved and stronger NDCs, nationally determined contributions, the action that each country will take. Only 24 countries increased their NDC, and the synthesis report by the UN just at the start of the COP showed that all of these NDCs together are nowhere near enough. They have us on track to a temperature increase of at least 2.5 degrees by 2100. So although this was promoted as an implementation COP, I think that's somewhere where it actually fell short. We didn't see follow-up on the commitments made at Glasgow, and there wasn't enough evidence of real commitment to reducing emissions by every single country that was there.
Wow. It feels like now certainly is the time we need to see those commitment to emission reductions coming through. So before I move over to Tom, Tara, overall, your verdict on the key outcomes of this COP, how would you sum it up?
So I'm really pleased as someone who's worked on climate justice for years and years and years that there was good news on loss and damage, especially for the countries and communities that are already experiencing those irreparable losses to lives, to livelihood, to their economies. But loss and damage is the end of the line. It's what happens because we don't take action to reduce emissions. So the imperative to keep everyone safe and to reduce the losses and irreparable damages that we inflict on ourselves is to keep warming to 1.5. And that means we need near-term action right now in all countries to reduce emissions. And that's what we didn't see enough of. I was in COP because I was submitting a report that I was a co-author of, a culmination of a 2.5-year process of listening to over 100 experts and a dialogue with policymakers. And what our report found is that 1.5 is not dead, but it is breathing its last gasp, and we really desperately need to act now. And I cannot come up with any other way of saying act now. We've been saying it for years. Yeah. Really important to understand the KPI, like 1.5 degrees, that temperature goal is not a KPI we can miss. It's a safety threshold for humanity. And it's in our interest to achieve it, and we're not doing that yet. And our report also found that we have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have the data, we have everything we need to be able to do this. This is now a question of leadership and political will. So I'm pleased we got where we did on loss and damage. I'm disappointed we didn't see more of the implementation and action, and a stronger statement from the leaders that they understand that 1.5 is the only safe threshold. Any little increment above that puts us at more risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Tara. I'm delighted to bring in Tom Mitchell, Executive Director of IIED, joining us. Tom was also at COP, a veteran at many COPs. Before I move on to Tom, do please keep your questions coming in the chat. We're delighted to hear from you and have your engagement. Tom, I'll start off with a straightforward question. How was COP for you this year?
So I think similar to Tara, the COP has reached a scale which is really quite immense. Just to give you an insight, it took about 20 to 25 minutes to walk from one side of the COP venue to another. The food outlets were completely overwhelmed, so getting access to food was really challenging. At some points, even getting access to water was difficult because I think the number of people had just overwhelmed the preparations that the Egyptians had made and that the UN had made. And the other thing for me is the signposting, really challenging, right? If you've got a meeting location and you needed to negotiate essentially what your way was over the size of a town, this was a medium-sized town, the ability to find a particular pavilion or a meeting space within that venue without any real guidance was very challenging. So I missed 2 meetings just because I was wandering around, didn't know where the hell to be. So from a kind of experience, COP was challenging just because of the scale that we've got to and some of the lack of organization, quite frankly. But as a place to meet people and to connect with those leading the climate agenda in different parts of the world, it's a phenomenal opportunity. And you can organize your own meetings, but it's actually the people you bump into in the corridors, the chance discussions that you have that can create really fabulous new connections, new business opportunities, new ways of influence that gives COP the edge. But I would really appreciate a bit better organization, a bit less chaos, a bit more signposting. But this certainly was by far the biggest and most chaotic of all the COPs that I've been to.
Wow, I think I saw someone tweet a photograph of like a warehouse full of signs that hadn't been distributed. So that certainly tallies with what I heard, and you're bang on, I think, as well, hearing about the kind of the side meetings and the networking opportunities and how much discussion and progress is made through impromptu meetings at COPs also adds their value. In the early days of COPs, there was a focus, I think it's fair to say, on mitigation, reducing emissions, and there was less focus on understanding climate impacts and risks. It feels like climate impacts and risks have been rising up the agenda. How is climate risk involved in this COP, and why should businesses be interested or keep track of climate risk?
Yeah, excellent question. So I started going to COPs back in 2005, just as the climate risk kind of element was really raising up the agenda. And that was, I think, partly driven by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was assessing that if we weren't making sufficient progress with reducing emissions, then the result was increased impacts. So whether more extreme storms or floods or droughts, or some of the more slow onset impacts like salinization or sea level rise and so on. And so that kind of specter of impact has been increasing more and more understanding around it as we've failed essentially to move at the speed and scale we needed on mitigation. And so over the period, certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been more and more focus, including with business, on looking at adapting to those impacts. And for business, I'm sure many of those on this call, their businesses have experienced disruptions to their supply chains. They've experienced employees not being able to get to work. They've experienced challenges around pricing and access and you know, whole set of things that can be driven by the impacts of climate change. Now, within the context of the international process, more effort has then been given to how to finance people's efforts to adapt to climate change, particularly in the developing world. And now, as Tara highlighted, the additional component is to say, if you can't adapt to it, you're essentially seeing the impacts, whether it's houses destroyed, whether it's your livelihoods disappearing, or actually some of the non-economic impacts as well, such as impacts on mental health, or on loss of culture, or needing to leave your home area and never return. So these things have been very much bubbling up and are now much more central within the agenda. And I think for business, the other angle here is that there is a business opportunity through adaptation and resilience. And so more and more businesses are spotting that actually they can develop products, goods, services that can take advantage of now a fast-growing adaptation economy. And so we saw at this COP, probably the biggest that I've seen to date, a business lobby and a business interest that was about trying to take advantage of the fact that the world needs to adapt and it needs to prevent loss and damage. And that's one of the key new trends.
Yeah, fascinating. Over the course of COP here in Ireland, we saw in Irish newspapers, like the Irish Times, for example, run headlines and editorials about failure to keep pledges, global temperature aligned with 1.5 degrees. Why haven't we seen at COP27, do you think, more commitments that actually align with 1.5 degrees? Why are we missing the mark here?
So I think the energy crisis and partly the war in Ukraine and its impact on energy markets has been a key factor here. And that's because for many politicians that they are scared about the prices for energy in their countries, making sure that people can get access to energy, the concerns, whether they're founded or not, about blackouts and so on. And so it's politically very challenging to step forward at a time and saying we have to take very bold choices about our own energy mix at a time when people are suffering. And I think, therefore, there's a political bargain that's being struck at the moment, which is about balancing increased ambition on 1.5 with needing to tackle that more imminent energy crisis. Now, I think the smarter governments are treating it as an opportunity to invest in renewables, to think about really shifting fundamentally that energy mix onto a low carbon pathway. And other less smart governments are effectively subsidizing fossil fuels in a big way, including new exploration. And I think that's the bargain at the moment that's really playing out. And taking advantage of that is a fossil fuel lobby. And I was acknowledging, I think, through even just my own experience at COP, that the fossil fuel lobby that is essentially trying to run interference in the process was more prominent than I'd ever seen before. And with the backing of countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia and many of the other Gulf states, the idea of introducing low emissions fuel into the agreement, which was one of the things that happened, was an acknowledgement that actually there should be sustained investment in gas in particular, or potentially in carbon capture and storage technologies and so on. And so we were really seeing the fossil fuel lobby get to that political process and influence it, I think, in a much greater way than we've seen before, taking the opportunity of the energy crisis. Now, I think the question is, what do we do next? This is a real problem for the world. And I think, of course, the longer we delay action on reducing emissions, the more loss and damage we're going to have to pay, the more parts of the world that will become increasingly uninhabitable. And of course, one of the impacts of that is more migration. The right-wing governments that we see across Europe worried about immigration, needing to deal with that and so on. So you've got this really tense set of issues at the moment. But I think the next COP being in the United Arab Emirates, being hosted in Dubai, it's going to be really interesting to see the extent to which that fossil fuel lobby becomes even more powerful in negotiations. And so I think that's the challenge we face right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So many good points there. I mean, I think in Ireland we've had a sense. I mean, maybe we have lots of sustainability experts on this call, so we might be a little more advanced than the average. But that climate change is something that happens elsewhere, and not to us necessarily here in Ireland, or at least will be last, but all those issues that you just discussed are here and present with us now. So we touched on there, as you were saying, Tom, the role of governments in influencing policy, for example. But could we dive a little bit more into the role of businesses as you see it? Businesses' role in influencing policy, businesses' role in influencing governments. Have you seen good examples of businesses being very progressive and taking positive actions? And simultaneously, what does bad look like? Have you seen examples where businesses have maybe been talking the talk but not walking the walk?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, Kieran. And there really is a span of business engagement at COP. And I think you've got those companies that are saying, look, we want to be absolutely on track with 1.5 degrees. We're signing up to what's talked about as science-based targets, and so willing to open up their business books to scrutiny around their alignment to a 1.5 degree future. So you've got that end of the spectrum, right through to the other end of the spectrum, which is businesses that are really trying to disrupt things. They are paying lobbyists, they are supporting research, they're running insidious communications campaigns, they sit behind some of the things that you see on social media that is trying to disrupt the level of certainty around the science of climate change. You've got that whole span. I think where it's often quite difficult to assess is where you've got an organization that is really talking about its climate change targets and choosing not to talk about all the bad things that it does. And I think that sense of greenwashing is very much there. And I actually heard a chief executive from a bank say that actually talking about their own targets, acknowledging that was greenwashing, but he said, of course, it's better to have a discussion about greenwashing than not at all. And so I think there is still an acknowledgement within business that things aren't really shifting, and that there is this whole kind of span of communications that is really pulling the wool over our eyes. And so, there are groups out there that actually do assessment of business and whether they're certain. And I think for those businesses on the call here that you're questioning some of those practices in your own business and to see whether they're genuinely aligned with Paris, worth really looking at the type of assessments that others are doing now, and really seeing whether or not there's confidence in that. What I would say is there is a very strong progressive business lobby at COP. Certainly the things that Tara was referring to, something like We Mean Business, brings together networks of businesses. The Science-Based Targets Initiative brings together those networks of businesses that are really positive. They do have a positive effect. But to acknowledge that you're in a fight against a group of businesses that are not having a positive effect. And somebody once said to me, look, it's really important when the enemy is taking really sharp knives to the problem, that the action against them isn't being led by those with plastic forks. So you need to be fighting in a sense where there is really a fight here between progressives and those who are trying to detract from the process. And you saw that very visibly in COP, and I think others in the chat that I'm noticing some of the questions around. I expect the UAE COP, the next COP, to be even more diverse in terms of business interests. Last thing I would say, the implementation COP angle here is important for business as well. For businesses to be able to say, what are you actually doing now to improve the situation, rather than saying what you'd like to do in the future, as a way of kind of obfuscating some of that responsibility. So I think it's really important to highlight what you're doing now, and then talk about why you may not have been able to achieve all the plans and how you're going to change that. Because this sense of implementation, it's for now, not for some years in the future. There is no time to waste. And to ask yourselves fundamentally, will I have a business in 10, 20, 30 years' time if we don't act together? And for many businesses, I think there is a real fundamental long-term structural challenge to profitability if you don't act.
Absolutely. A quote I never thought we'd have from this webinar is, don't bring a plastic spoon to a knife fight, or some plastic fork to a sharpened knife fight. But it's a good one, and I completely agree with you that I don't think there's a large number of businesses I don't think fully realize this is systemic risk to their operation that's going to take place over the next, even just the short term. And that realization is still to occur. So final question for you, Tom. We've had Tara's verdict on COP27. What's your verdict on COP27? Success, failure, mixed bag? What do you think?
Well, look, for all of the people who've been fighting for nearly 3 decades to essentially agree a form of compensation mechanism, the loss and damage fund, it was a really, really significant moment. But in some ways, as Tara highlighted, it's an admission of failure at the same time. And I think the kind of hypocritical aspect of COP then is that you celebrate setting up a loss and damage fund, but actually you don't tackle the fundamental cause of the problem.
Yeah.
And for me, that backsliding on emissions targets or softening of language around 1.5 is a real shame. And I think on balance, we can probably say that COP27 was not a good COP in terms of helping to tackle the problem. But nonetheless, let's celebrate the fact that there are people who've dedicated a generation of action to setting up loss and damage fund, and that there are positive signs that we might actually see money flowing to where it needs to get to.
Absolutely. I think it's agreed that if civil society and activists and people have dedicated their lives to this hadn't done so, we wouldn't have loss and damage. So it's their work that has to be applauded, and it's just outstanding. So to kind of finish off, your take-home messages from both of you for our audience, if I can push you one from a business perspective, what can from our people who are working as sustainability leaders in businesses, what would be your short, succinct take-home message for them from this webcast? Tara, I'll go to you first.
Yeah. Number one, implementation happens with you, with us. Okay, so it doesn't happen in a COP. A COP sets the direction of travel. It gets the climate change into the headlines. The action happens with us. So it's time for all businesses to stop telling and start showing. You have to show us what you're doing. We have to show each other what we're doing. We have to learn those lessons. And business has a role in mitigation to bring emissions down, in adaptation to manage climate risk. And ultimately, business will ultimately have a role in loss and damage too, because we're going to have to find innovative ways of financing and building up a pot of money for these reparations. So business is implicated in every single part of what is going to happen. But if you do one thing today, it's start doing things and start showing all of your stakeholders what it is that you are doing to take climate action.
Brilliant. Love it. Tom, same question to you.
I think Tara said a lot, but I think what I would highlight, I think for business in particular, is don't now think of climate change as a set of risks somewhere on the horizon. These, for your businesses, may be fundamental strategic risks that challenge the future of your business. And if you're a sustainability officer or you're working on climate change, do your level best to make sure that the risk management framework within your company is treating climate change as a business risk for the future, as a profitability risk, and as a fundamentally existential risk. Because I think that's where we are now. And if it's not being treated like that, then it's not being taken seriously.
Absolutely. And my take-home message for this audience would be, if you're sat there and you're wondering how to get your business started, you want to have an initial conversation to find what the right direction is, whether it be just upskilling people, starting a strategy, working out your climate risk, do get in touch with Change by Degrees. Even just put it down into the chat here. We'd love to talk to you. Get in touch, leave a chat message, or email us at info@changebydegrees. We'd love to hear and have just a conversation with you. That's what it's all about. And so I'd just like to thank Tara and Tom for their excellent insights today. I will be sharing a recording of the webcast to everyone who's registered, so look out for that in your inbox. As I say, if you have also any ideas for the next Climate Club, we want to talk about the topics that matter to you most. Also, we'd love to hear ideas, put them in the chat, or again, send us an email at info@changebydegrees. Upcoming topics we are looking at is employee engagement on sustainability and carbon footprinting. But if you have any others you'd like to hear about, do get in touch. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again. And thanks again to Tara and Tom for their time.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.